Hello and welcome to a special sponsored edition of Spectator TV. I'm Kate Andrews, economics editor here at The Spectator. Most people aspire to be able to help their families, especially after decades of working hard. But with a cost of living crisis, for many families, providing that financial help isn't just an aspiration, but a necessity. So how can people maximize their financial options to navigate rising costs, not just for themselves, but for their kids and their grandkids? What are the complexities surrounding retirement planning? And what impact can care responsibilities have? Joining me today to discuss these issues and hopefully provide some answers, we have Peter Aylward, Director of Financial Planning at Charles Stanley, and Sam Brodbeck, Money Advice Editor at the Telegraph. Thank you both so much for joining me. Peter, to you first, a big thanks to Charles Stanley for making this event possible with The Spectator. Charles Stanley has done some polling in this area looking at family structures and family dependency, and the results may be surprising to some. They found that 35% of parents have a child over the age of 17 still living with them, but of that 35%, 25% have a child in their 30s who's living with them. Grandparents are spending on average £1,000 a month for family dependence. Talk us through some of these findings and what Charles Stanley's saying.
I think what we're really seeing now is, in the past we've spoken a lot about the bank of parents and bank of mum and dad, but now it's the bank of grandparents are helping as well. Especially in that group of parents in the age of 45 to 55, we still got a big mortgage, you got high costs, and you might also be spending time looking after aging relatives as well. Yeah, so it is difficult.
And Sam, there seems to be a compound effect here. Millennials, 40% of them, based on Charles Stanley's findings, are already saying that they expect their children could be looking after them one day. Now, these millennials, if they have kids already, will have a pretty young-ish family, and they're already thinking about these things. It seems that everybody's looking to see who might be providing the money at some point. It feels like a very insecure time.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a millennial, and I've got kids in nursery. And you know, I think you said £1,000 a month grandparents are sort of setting aside to help. And you know, I'm not getting £1,000 a month from my parents, but they're definitely helping us with like looking after our kids, turning up at funny times when we have to work.
Which would be a huge cost if you didn't have parents who could help with childcare. I mean, that is one of the biggest costs for families.
That's right. It's sort of the wraparound care that people haven't really cracked yet. So it kind of gets filled with grandparents' time and money. So it's kind of a whole multi-generational team effort at the moment.
But let's speak about that insecurity. Everybody's very familiar with what we've been through the past couple of years. The inflation crisis has been horrifying for many people. The cost of living crisis has spiraled out of control. But Peter, we were talking before the event started about how this has actually been a very mixed picture, that whilst inflation has wreaked havoc for so many people, for others, it's boosted their savings.
Absolutely. Broadly speaking, about 30% of people are better off with higher interest rates, just because they've got savings, no debt, and they've got other assets. 30% hasn't made much of a difference, just because they're fairly settled in what they do. And then in the middle, there are those, like we say, the sandwich parents who are they are the ones who have found it hardest, and they are the ones who are relying a bit more on on their own elderly parents to help provide for everyone.
But Sam, we do have to negotiate the state we're in and think about financial planning around it, because whilst there has been a lot of talk about the base rate coming down at some point this year, the Bank of England has been very clear that when that starts to happen, and that may not be for some time yet, that's going to be a slow and steady process. That's
right, yeah. And I mean, we're probably never going to go back to the position we were in sort of mid-pandemic, when you could get a mortgage for 1%. I think probably if you were in that position, it's going to be 3 or 4%, probably. So that's hundreds of pounds. Likely, you're going to be paying extra on your mortgage.
And there's an argument we shouldn't go back to that time. You know, that wasn't normal, that wasn't healthy for the economy. But that very fast change in interest rates is what shocked a lot of people. And chances are, by the end of the year, even if there's some change to the headline rate, it won't be too significant.
That's right, and I think a lot of our readers anyway, the decision they make or need to make is that a lot of them are on tracker mortgages now, and they're sort of waiting, when do I lock in, when's sort of the new normal? And that's the question we get a lot of the time. Everyone wants to know what's going to happen, but at the end of the day, it's kind of, what risk can you deal with? Can you afford an extra 500 quid? Do you lock in 450 quid now? So no one knows the answer, and it's a slight gamble, which is slightly worrying when it's a large mortgage.
Sure, and there are lots of things we're not going to be able to answer, but we're going to do our best over the next 40 minutes to figure out where we can provide some of those answers in very turbulent times. I just want to remind everybody who's watching at the office or at home that you can submit questions. We're going to be taking live questions in about 15 minutes time. If you submit a question in the box just at the bottom of your screen, they'll come directly to me, and I'll try to get as many in as possible. Peter, how would you say financial advice has shifted over the past 2 years with the inflation crisis? As Sam was saying, there's so much we can't predict, but what do we have a good sense of, and how has that changed the way that you give advice?
I think one of the biggest changes have been with retirement options. Annuities have been unfashionable, well, for 10, 15 years or so, and now people are looking more towards security in retirement, and so annuities, we are starting to see much more of those now. That's the main change, and also the decision about whether you can afford to retire. People are starting to bring that forward a bit more now and trying to plan more, just to try to get some certainty in an uncertain world.
Sam, what are you finding from readers? What kinds of questions are they writing in with, and how's your advice changing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you talk about annuities. So, annuities obviously are an insurance contract. So you give them they give the insurer lots of money, and they give you £5,000, £6,000 a year. Our readers are kind of dead set against that. They like the idea of being in control of their money, and I suppose they're a bit more sophisticated than probably maybe the average person on the street, and they like to manage their own money. So a lot of the questions we get are, I've got this amount of money, I need to gift it to various children and grandchildren. I want to minimise my tax. And I want to invest it, and where do I put the money? So that's the kind of stuff we're getting asked. How do I grow my money quicker than inflation's going to eat it away?
Peter, what are the most common types of mistakes that you see people make when it comes to their retirement and handling financial security, not just in the years leading up to retirement, but potentially over the decades? I
think the biggest problem is leaving it too late to start to save. I'm a big believer of making sure you auto-enroll from your very first job, because ultimately if you're paying 4%, you're getting 8% in your kitty, and that has 40 years to grow, whilst leaving it later, your portfolio's got less times to grow. Another problem have been people using lifestyle funds, so self-investors using funds which are de-risked as you run up to retirement, but with the rise in interest rates, those funds have suffered badly, meaning that you having to retire later or put more money in.
Sam, auto-enrollment has been very helpful in getting more people to invest earlier, but there's still major questions about whether or not it's enough.
Yeah. I think most people agree it probably isn't enough. I think we're saving around 8% now on the minimum, which I think is about half of what it probably should be. So that definitely needs to come up. And there are other gaps. So, for example, self-employed people. There's millions of people are self-employed, and there's no scheme that they're being enrolled in. I think the government did look at this and decided not to do anything, possibly because it was too complicated. But there are these big groups of people who are going to get to retirement, and they're going to probably just have the state pension and maybe a business, maybe a property, which are very difficult to value 30 years into the future.
And Peter, at what age should people start looking at what they've saved up so far and start asking questions of themselves like, am I on track to retire at the age that I want? Am I going to be looking at working an additional 3, 5, 10 years? Is there an appropriate age to start doing that? 25 to me would be a bit young, right? You couldn't possibly know what's going to happen. But at what point would you start advising people to say, look, here's when we start to assess how long you're going to be working for? And how does family dependency play into that as well? Because your calculations as a parent or grandparent may have shifted based on what's happened in the past few years.
The time to really take control of your long-term financial planning, I believe, is in your early 40s, because that's when you're starting to go towards your earning peak, and it might be a time when your outgoings on family start to come down. That planning from that point on can give you the chance to do things like salary sacrifice and bonus sacrifice to make your pensions work a bit harder. It's important not to rely on an inheritance, I think, to fund your retirement, simply because with care costs, there's still uncertainty about that is going to cost you. So an assumed inheritance can disappear very, very quickly. So by starting earlier, that gives you more time just to be in control of when you want to retire, and it will also enable you to really choose, choose and plan exactly what you want to do in retirement, so that then you can make sure you've got a figure in your mind that you can work up towards.
And Sam, these are all moving parts. So Peter speaks there about, not making assumptions around what kind of inheritance you might want to get. And from the policy perspective, social care has been spoken about for a long time. £13 billion a year was, in theory, put towards it by Boris Johnson, but that money is going to the National Health Service right now, and lots of people don't think it's ever meaningfully being moved away from the health service. So care costs, what your parent will be paying in care costs, but what you might have to dish out on top of that to support and provide care to others in your family is a big factor too.
Yeah, that's right. And our readers actually are terrified. Terrified of the potential unlimited costs, because there were plans for a cap to come in. So I think it was talked about 100 grand maybe, or 150,000. That's never happened. So how do you plan when you have no idea what the top end is? In fact, it kind of encourages you to get rid of your money if you think it's all going to be eaten up in the last year or so of your life. So there's that kind of side. There's no limits on this, which also means there are no products really. The insurance industry, for example, maybe could build something to protect against that if they knew what the ultimate cost was. But at the moment, it's uncapped. People often worry as well about their homes. I think a lot of our readers and most people in Britain who are homeowners, they want to pass on their house. Yeah. And that drives a lot of their financial decision making. We've seen some people kind of run into trouble with that, where they might have been encouraged by slightly dubious firms to put the home into trust, to stop the government taking it for, and that's not how the rules work. But there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, and it's driving the wrong behaviours at the moment. And people essentially don't really save for their care costs until you're really confronted with that. You don't think about it, and that is a problem.
We'll get on to housing. We already have questions rolling in about housing. And just a reminder, if you've just tuned in, if you're watching at the office or at home, you can submit a question. We're going to be taking live questions in just a few minutes in the box below your screen. If you type in your question, they'll come directly to me, and I'll get through as many as we can. And I'm certain we're going to get a lot about homes, and we'll come on to that. But a big part of our discussion today is about the family element of this, the financial planning that goes into supporting a family, of course, when you have a young family, but also these days certainly to be providing a lot of that support as your kids and grandkids grow older. Peter, how do people best go about educating their children and their grandchildren to prepare their own finances and to handle family assets?
Yeah. That is tricky. It's not on the national curriculum in schools, right, to learn how to manage your money, which I think is a shame, and how to run a budget. So that is a skill parents and grandparents need to teach children, really starting in the teenage years, so when they go off to college, they know how to manage a budget. That is very important. There are also various milestones. So if someone is looking to buy a house, whether or not you can provide help for that, because gifts don't have to be money. You can gift by paying for things like helping with childcare, helping with mortgage deposits. I have one client, for example, who's helped reduce student loans, because that would then enabled their daughters to then put money into a pension. So, but that's really just shows the interaction that you need, and to not be afraid to confront financial decisions with your family. I'm a financial advisor. I'm a son of a financial advisor, and I never talked about money with my father until he was 78. So it's a common thing. It's a taboo, isn't it? Being very British about these things is not to talk about them. But I think that's to everyone's detriment, and it's important to be open, because where you have a generation who have benefited from the rising of interest rates, and you have a generation who are struggling with that, it's an easy way to transfer wealth down the generations and avoid inheritance tax.
Sam, there will be a disadvantage for families that are really keen to talk about these things and educate their children about how to handle their own assets when they are able to purchase them or come into them, how they handle their own finances, how they handle their own pension planning. And then there are families that won't be having those conversations. And as Peter says, this isn't taught in schools, and it's a difficult skill set to learn.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of our readers will cut out articles and then give it to their grandkids. That's still a thing that happens. And we're actually trying to cater for that a bit more now. Rather than assuming everyone is a bit older and understands these things, we also do kind of fairly basic explaining what stuff is.
Yeah.
What is a pension? Maybe we all know, but there's no reason you'd know until you were much, much older, I think, normally, if you worked in a different line of work. There is a lot out there now. There are sort of free government helplines as well. If you can't afford a financial advisor, or you think that's not quite right for you, you can call things called the Money Helper is one, for example, and that will give you free advice over the phone. It won't tell you what to do, but it might give you some information. Again, you've got to be quite engaged to even start thinking about that. And I think you're right about the conversation point, because people have been saying this for years. British, we don't talk enough about money, and that's to our own detriment. Nothing's really changed. So I'm not sure how we, nudged the dial. Yeah. Student loans is probably one area actually where you start to realise much younger than you used to, when no one used to worry about it. Now it's such a big deal. Actually, you kind of have to engage when you get that statement that says you've got £50,000 of debt.
I'm curious as well, Sam, about how much younger generations are taking financial advice seriously. I mean, a lot of younger generations have this opinion that you can just do everything through an app, and that any advice that you need, you'll be able to get it through an app, or you'll be able to get it through Googling an article. That this idea around financial planning and advisors and the rest of it is something more outdated. I mean, there is so much more technology at our disposal now, and I think in general that's been hugely beneficial. That's not exactly the same thing, not to say that you have to have an actual financial advisor. Lots of people aren't in a position to be able to do that. But having an app is not going to be the same thing as actually understanding how these processes work.
No, I think there's huge limitations. Anyone who's ever used a sort of chat for a banking app will know that you don't normally get what you're looking for.
Right.
But like I said, there are lots of things you can do. You just have to be really active. And I think one tip I would give people, a lot of companies now, for their employees will say, oh, we have a relationship with a financial advice firm, and they come in once a month or something, and they can chat through things for you. And that's like quite an easy way. You might just have to get off from your desk and go around the corner. Someone comes in once a week. And again, they won't be able to tell you, you need to invest in BP, invest in Shell. It'll be much more like, lay everything out on the table. You've got your pension here, you've got your savings here. Maybe you want to buy a house, and they'll just kind of start that conversation.
One question we have had through, which is relevant to this conversation, so I'm going to ask it now, is, Peter, if you were to recommend one aspect of financial planning to help your child or your children, what would it be? Is there anything that particularly sticks out in your mind?
Well, number one would be manage your budget. That's the most important thing. I think if someone is a little bit older starting work, before you have assets, you have to protect yourself with insurance. So make sure you find out what would happen if you weren't able to work through illness. I think that's number one, because that will give you your safety net. A lot of the time it is provided just through your employment contract, but just to investigate these things, just to know where you stand.
Right. And do you think people are in a position to be giving their children this advice? I mean, again, your readers might be a very particular breed of reader, but do you think that people are educated enough themselves to be able to pass on this advice?
I think one thing, particularly the older generation's value, is our pensions. So that generation had defined benefit pensions. I often hear, I was told day one in the job, someone came over to me and said, make sure you're in the pension scheme. Yeah. Particularly the old generous ones that were, they don't really exist anymore in the private sector. But if you're starting on day one, even on a relatively small salary, pretty soon you've got enough for a car. And I think once you've got enough that you think I could buy a car with that, you start to engage with it a bit more, and quite quickly it'll probably it'll be your biggest asset. Particularly if it takes you a long time to buy your first property. Yeah. You might have £50,000 by the time you're 25, 26, and suddenly, it's not like retirement isn't this thing that will never happen to you, which I think a lot of young people think. You sort of, in a way, have to forget about the pounds and pence come out your payslip. Right. But once it gets to a big enough amount, suddenly you start to feel a bit empowered.
I just want to remind our watchers at home and in the office that you can submit questions. We're going to be taking more live questions in just a few minutes. If you write them into the box at the bottom of the screen, they will come directly to me, and I'm going to put as many to our panel as possible. Let's quickly talk about pensions before we go to some of these questions, because it's a very interesting time, especially for the state pension, which has gone up dramatically because of the inflation crisis and because wages were also going up as workers demanded more money. I think, Is it possible that this brief time could skew the way that younger generations actually look at the state pension? I mean, they're not receiving it in the same way, but could it give them the false sense of security that it will always rise in this way?
Well, the triple lock is, it's not a cast iron guarantee, is it?
No, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon.
It's not, yeah, especially with an election. No one's going to talk about the triple lock. But you're, yes, it's been a big change. So until the 2010s, the state pension went up with inflation, which is significantly less than wages. And now you get the double bubble of the inflationary rises, wages lag, and you get that as well. So, but the state pension is still not enough to live on when you retire. And so, although it's better than it was, you still, the initiative still has to be with you to decide what to do when you retire. A rule of thumb is when you retire, your pension should be worth a bit more than your house. So, it's a very basic rule. And the other rule we used to always have, which has probably gone up now with inflation, was to say try to be at £100,000 by the time you're 40, because if you double that every year, that's how you end up with a decent pension fund. But yeah, don't trust what your own decisions are, and trust that if you put money into your pension and you give it time, you'll be okay. But if you don't and you leave it too late, the state pension is not enough to live on.
What have you made of the pensions whirlwind over the past few years?
I mean, the triple lock is one of these stories that every time you write anything about, everyone's incredibly engaged and everyone has an opinion.
Yes.
So what the costs are, I think 120 billion a year, something like that. Obviously, you'll get some of that back in tax. So that's a huge amount of money, and every chancellor will always look at this and think, can I get some of that money back? I think the problem is, you make a really good point that at the moment, you have a generation of pensioners who have a nice DB pension, they've got a triple lock protected state pension. Overall, that's looking pretty good. But as that DB disappears, and Generation X and millennials come through, they're probably only going to have the state pension as a guaranteed bit of income. So although we've been talking about, can it survive, is it too generous? Actually, I wonder if it goes the other way, because there won't be anything else. Something's going to have to quite dramatically change for sort of the private sector workforce for that not to be the bulk of their income and retirement. What's going to be really interesting is if Labour get this huge majority, super majority, I think the Spectator's called it. Would they be,
a few weeks ago, yeah.
Would they be brave enough to go, okay, we've got this huge majority, there's a load of cash here, we need to pay for stuff. Let's do something at the beginning of this new parliament and hope that people sort of forget about it by the next election. That's it. If you're going to do it, that's the time to do something big.
It would be a remarkable and quite shocking shift, to be honest. But to your point about affordability, especially down the line, I think a lot of people, millennials and younger, aren't so convinced they're going to see the state pension or the triple lock in the way that it exists now.
So the triple lock stays, or the state pension age has to go up. Something has to change.
Right. Something has to give in terms of the cost.
Well, it's a legacy of a low inflationary times, isn't it, the triple lock? Because at the time, it didn't seem like a big thing, but suddenly, like you're saying, woof, pensions are great.
Things change very quickly. That's the trouble with public policy. At the very end, I'm going to come back and ask you for a few policy predictions, Sam. But I want to move to some of our questions which are coming in. You can continue to submit live questions. We have a bunch coming in. I'm going to try to get through as many as possible. Just go to the box right below the screen, type in your question, and they come directly over to me. We're having a lot of questions come in about housing, unsurprisingly, and questions about what's going to happen to people's homes as they prepare for retirement and as they look to pass them on. I don't expect anyone to be able to answer a specific question about a specific situation that somebody's typed in about, but the broad theme here is how people protect their homes for retirement. Peter?
That's a very difficult one, because care fees are, you don't know whether or not you're going to get them or not, sadly. And then with inheritance tax, do you downsize to a smaller house to enable you to free up capital to help people? Downsizing doesn't always free up as much cash as people think, because assuming you want to stay in the same area and live in the same, losing one bedroom doesn't raise a lot of money. So, the problem with gifts is if you gift a property and you keep living there, that won't be classed as a gift for inheritance tax, because you've kept what's called a reservation of benefit. So another way around it is to accept that you'll have inheritance tax, but to say have insurance to pay the bill, so that if you want the actual property itself to be passed along as it is, that there is money available to pay the inheritance tax.
And that insurance would be on the care bills, yes?
Well, you could use it on your care bills, so you could put some money aside to. You can stop the care fees being open-ended by, say, for example, using an annuity. But the problem with annuities, if you die early on, they aren't value for money. But if you live in the care home for more than, say, 3-4 years, they work very well. But whichever choice you make, there are risks involved.
Indeed. And these are really difficult conversations to be having sometimes with relatives, older and younger, Sam, and tricky in terms of the negotiation of all that.
I think, yeah, exactly. And you're right about the downsizing thing, because you read lots of papers all the time. If only we can make people downsize, that would sort of solve all our issues. I think you're right. There aren't enough sort of suitable places to go to. A lot of the time, there aren't loads of bungalows, which is what everyone wants.
And of course, you're paying the stamp duty.
That's right, and there have been calls for a stamp duty sort of discount for downsizes. I don't know how that would actually work in practice and what would qualify as a downsizing. And it feels like it sounds simple, but actually in reality would be very complicated. But we do have these millions of so-called spare bedrooms, and someone needs to think of a way to to get at them. We're going to probably talk about this a bit more maybe, but house building, we don't build enough of the right kind of houses. Now we have lots of new build flats in London and near railway stations, but generally people don't live in them very long.
Well, I mean, a big question we're having coming through from multiple people is how do I best help my children and grandchildren get on the property ladder? To which one of the answers to that is going to be that we need to build more homes. That for many people, even with the support to get on the property ladder, the bank of mom and dad, as we were talking about before, even then, it's going to be really, really tough because there are just so few homes being built in the UK.
That's right, and I think, if you're particularly in London and the South East, you have to have an enormous salary and ability to save to not need parental help to get on the property ladder. I think, it must be, I can't imagine many people doing it. You'd have to have a lot of money. So in terms of what you can do to help children, there are small things like lifetime ISAs that are sort of specifically built for buying a first property. But again, the limits are quite low. It'll take you a long time to get anywhere near a kind of an average deposit. So I think it's the difficult conversation again. You sort of need to have that as early as possible in a way. You say, look, I know we're talking about this 20, 30 years before we need to really, but if it's possible, I'd rather have my inheritance now if it's available when you don't need it, rather than 20, 30 years when I'll be 50 and long beyond the time I want to buy my first property.
Peter, something's going very badly wrong here. As we premised our conversation today, of course, it's an aspiration for people at all different ages at some point to be able to help their family, and very often in a financial manner. It makes people feel really good to do that, but that shouldn't be a requirement for getting on the property ladder in places like London and the South East.
I agree. Yes, it's to answer. It's such a big question to answer because you could argue that you can move jobs out of London, for example. You can, it's bigger than just a family, than just talking about the family. Where I think you're absolutely right is it's easy to think, well, it was quite hard in my day to buy a house. I had to save up to the deposit. I did that, and I missed a few holidays, to get my deposit together, but it was eminently possible.
Right.
It is especially hard for people now, especially in the South East. So
you make an important point there, that it isn't that nobody should be expected to sacrifice something. It's you could sacrifice everything today and still not be able to scrape together what's necessary to get on the housing ladder. Not least because rents are so high.
Absolutely, and so it is incredibly hard. And if you, I think, for say a grandparent where you're in that cohort who have done better out of the rising interest rates, it doesn't just have to be gifts. I mean, if you've got income that you don't need, for example, that can be gifted. and if it's done regularly, that is out of your estate from day one. And you can make a big impact over time. Could be whether it's school fees or whether it is with helping with mortgages, etc. The day-to-day mortgage costs, and it's an incredibly tax-efficient way of doing it.
We get asked that a lot actually, because these are the kind of gifting out of earned income rules, aren't they? Which I think not many people know about.
Well, interest as well, bank interest, dividends, ISA income,
I didn't know that.
All counts, yeah.
And I think people often ask us, how do I record all this stuff? Because at the end of the day, at some point, HMRC will have a look at this and go, should inheritance tax be applied? So I think the advice generally, I might just kind of keep really detailed.
You can, if you go on the HMRC website, there is an IHT form where every year you can detail what you have to demonstrate is that you've got surplus income, it is genuine income, but also that you're not curtailing your own standard of living, and so you can say this is my income, these are my costs, this is my surplus, that's been gifted, and you can every year you can do it on the form with the HMRC.
We have had a few questions through asking what is the best way to gift money to your children and grandchildren. I guess perhaps part of your answer is to be detailed.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We have a few questions coming in about what a next government might do, Sam. One question about what perhaps a Labour Party, if in power, might do around pension savings. Is it possible that a Labour Party might mean test the state pension? Is that one way of tackling the issue? And then there are other questions about what the Labour Party might do around inheritance tax. Interestingly, no questions about what the Conservative Party might do. Now, maybe that's because they've been in power for so long and we have a sense, but maybe that's because people think Labour is going to be making up the next government. These are surely questions you're thinking about.
Yeah, the means testing one's interesting because they do that in Australia with their state pension, and that sort of feels probably quite fair. Again, I reckon it will come down to how complicated does that work, and how do people will find ways around means testing. Pensions is an interesting one. Although pretty certain it's going to be a Labour government in some shape or form. They haven't really said much. One of the things they have said is that they will reimpose the overall cap on how much you can have in your pension, which Conservatives have just abolished. It used to be, you could say, the lifetime allowance, you could save just over £1 million. That's now gone. Labour have said they will bring it back. We were just talking before, weren't we? Will they actually do that? It seems like a, quite anti-aspirational thing to do as soon as you come in. But they have said they'll do it. The purpose of it was to try to get certain professions to stay and work longer, mainly doctors and consultants. So I think one of the big questions will be, has it made an impact on those professions? And if it is keeping people in work longer, harder to take it back, isn't it? That's right. Maybe they do a carve out and say doctors and senior nurses are allowed to be exempt, but then that doesn't feel very fair and isn't fair. So that'd be very difficult, I think. At the moment there's a certain amount of chaos, I think, out there because the cap got abolished quite quickly and it's taken a long time for the rules to come in place. So I imagine a lot of your clients are a bit kind of, what do I do? Do I act as if Labour are going to bring this back in, and how does that impact what I do today? Yes. So in a tricky situation. Well, you can only go on what we know. One of the benefits of the ending of the lifetime allowance have been people who have protection on their pensions, whereby as the lifetime allowance has been reduced over time, if you've got protection back in the day and you put no more money in, you had a bigger lifetime allowance. But now you can have that protection and put more money in. And the worry would be for those people that if suddenly the lifetime allowance is brought back, they get stung for no fault of their own. We have been cautious in advising, but at the same time, it's an opportunity.
Sure. And inheritance tax is interesting as well, Peter, because there's been a lot of speculation over the past year that there could be a major shift in a particular direction on inheritance tax under the Tory party. Labour has not been very vocal on this, and we wouldn't expect them to be until they have to be. But how complicated is inheritance tax, and how complicated could changes to it be?
Well, at the moment, if you are a couple, married couple, and you've got children, with the various allowances, you have about £1 million that you can pass down to the generation. Part of that is your nil rate band, and then the residence nil rate band on top, which is based on the value of your property. That's quite simple. There are also allowances like the annual allowance, where you can gift £3,000 a year. That's out of your estate from day one. Once you've used up these annual allowances, and we spoke about the gifts out of income, then you're in what are called potentially exempt transfer territory, which is where if you make a gift and then you die within 7 years, that may come back into your estate. So the rules are fairly straightforward to follow, but we just have no idea what could change, and I doubt it will make it simpler.
Someone's written in to say, I have a lot of different workplace pensions from different jobs. When will the pensions dashboard project be up and running so I can easily view these and consolidate them? Is that something you find with your readers, Sam, that, it's very common these days to move jobs. People don't have one job for 50 years anymore. They bounce around. How easy is it to manage your pension, and should it be easier?
It is quite easy, but you have to sort of know everything is, and you have to fill out a load of forms. And the idea of the pension dashboard, whenever it exists, I mean, it's been talked about for years and years and years.
So you're not hopeful that's coming on board in the next 6 months?
I don't think it's due in the next 6 months.
Right.
I'm sure it will happen at some point, and that will probably be a bit of a game changer, particularly for people who have, they worked somewhere for 6 months and they've really lost track of it, and there'll be 500 quid here, £1,000 here, all in one place. It's a lot easier to manage. So that will be a bit of a game changer at that level. I wouldn't wait for the pension dashboard though. You can, if you do know where you used to work, hopefully people can remember that. It's fairly simple. You just fill out a few forms, and once it is in one place, suddenly you'll be quite surprised. It's probably bigger than you thought.
Another question, for those approaching retirement who have recently paid off debts but have about 10 to 15 years left of working life, what's the best way to approach savings? So presumably by debts they mean they've paid their mortgage off, they're in the clear, they're hoping to work for another 10 to 15 years. How should they be approaching that savings game?
Okay, well, if it's money that you feel you're not going to need for 10 to 15 years and you are a high rate taxpayer, then pensions is the obvious one, because you, in all likelihood, most people in retirement become basic rate taxpayers. And so if you're a high rate taxpayer and become a basic rate taxpayer, that's where pensions win. After that, you've got just simple things like your ISA allowance. That will make 20,000 a year, and there's no capital gains tax, no income tax, no tax on dividends. So that is an easy way to give yourself access to tax-free income and capital in the future. Those would be the obvious routes.
Very good. Another question, if you want to set up products for young children, what are the best ways to go about this? Premium bonds, trust, savings accounts? A lot of options out there. What do you advise? There
are. It's a question of control, I would say. So, for example, junior ISAs are great in that it is a tax-free allowance, but it can become your child's by right, when they reach maturity, and you can't do anything about it. If you want to gift with strings, then that would be looking at a trust. But trusts have their own sting in their tail in that they're not as tax efficient. So you've got to try and balance the two, and really decide how much do you trust your children.
Yeah, I'm slightly worried now because I've done some stuff with my kids, but I haven't set up a trust, and I didn't think about that they get control. I've got a very simple tracker fund. They invest in a stocks and shares ISA, so that's just slowly tracking the stock market over hopefully 18 years. And then they've got NS&I, who do premium bonds, have got a fairly decent rate at the moment on their cash ISA. So it's a little bit of flexibility, a bit of cash stuff and a bit of stock market.
Sam, I know your children are not yet teenagers, but have you thought much about how you'll speak to them about financial planning when they become teenagers? Because we have a question here asking, what is the best way to talk to your teenager about fiscal responsibility and financial planning?
Well, I was actually thinking about this because the bank I use, at the age of 6, you can get a sort of separate bank card that's ring-fenced for your child to get them to the idea of, here's your pocket money, but it's on a card now and I can track their spending. So I think that's probably what I'll be doing because my son turns 6 soon. He's going to get that. I still think cash has quite a good role to play here, and that's one it's sort of dying out, but if you go on TikTok and things, you'll find loads of videos of teenagers doing this cash stuffing where they take all their pocket money and divide it up and put it into envelopes and then use that as a way to kind of budget themselves. They have these booklets,
don't they, where they can, put the cash in different places.
Yeah, and I think that's quite nice. It's easy to visualise, isn't it? You can really, you have a sense of when you're spending money and when you've got stuff left over. So I think this is actually quite a well-served bit of financial services, I think, sort of children's finances now. There are lots of cards and things you can get. And other people can gift money into them if they do, chores on the street, that kind of thing.
Peter, this is an interesting question, and thinking about it from the perspective of potentially passing on the asset of your home, is it better to pay off your mortgage faster, our watcher asks, or use their available cash to invest in passive income streams?
Well, that's if paying off your mortgage, you're effectively giving yourself a pay rise, aren't you? When it's all done, my natural instinct would always be to reduce debt.
And do you think that's better for the family angle on this as well when you're talking about passing on assets?
Yes, absolutely. Because if you die and there is still debt, it's got to be repaid anyway, hasn't it? So it doesn't really, dying with debt doesn't make your beneficiaries any better off, does it? It just means it's a problem they've got to sort out. So, and also, I mean, for a very long period, I think we've not been fussed about repaying mortgages early. But now, if you've got the capital, if your mortgage rate is now 7%, if you can find a guaranteed return of more than 7% per year, don't pay off your mortgage. But I think most people can't, so you pay it off.
Do you agree with that, Sam? To focus on debt first?
I think what you said at the end there is the right thing, isn't it? It's about what interest rate are you paying on your debt, and what can you get elsewhere, and also how likely are you to actually do that? Because that is the rule of thumb. You know, if you can earn 5% on the stock market and that's higher than your 1% mortgage, then it makes sense to put money into the stock market. But if you're not doing that, then it's irrelevant. And I think most people, a lot of people have a bit of spare cash. They don't stick it into a stock market fund. But there's something about paying off your mortgage that kind of, I think everyone wants to do that, don't they?
It's a psychological thing.
Psychological thing, isn't it? Yeah, and you feel like, oh, there's a point where I won't have this anymore, and I can hasten that lovely day when there's no more mortgage to pay.
If you can, if interest rates do come down, if you can actually keep your payment where it is now, you'll clear your mortgage surprisingly quickly, compared to just, taking the pay rise really of a lower mortgage.
It has changed, hasn't it? The idea of,
point, yeah.
I feel like 5 years ago, people used to say, borrow as much as you can. You know, when you get a property, get the biggest mortgage you possibly can, maybe even use some of that money and buy a rental property. And that conversation, I think, is like completely disappeared now. You know, that's not the advice anymore. And people are,
People who took that advice may be in quite tricky situation at the moment if they're struggling with those higher payments. Yeah. And that's interesting, Peter. You're saying if you can handle the higher interest rate payments right now, if and when those rates do come down, try to stick with the higher payment because, if you've accustomed yourself to it and it's possible.
Just be careful because some mortgages will penalise you for overpayments. But you just got to read the paperwork.
A question here, Sam. Is it really possible to prepare my parents' finances and my own if they get sick and need care in old age?
Is it really possible?
Yeah.
I mean, you can do what you can. I mean, the main thing, I suppose, is power of attorney. Is probably the most important thing that you should have, kind of really any age, I think. And that's where you can take control of your parents. There are separate ones for finances and health. And having that in place will make things a lot easier when suddenly they're not able to make those sort of decisions. So I think that's the thing you should do straight away. And again, it goes back to the conversations of really setting things out. You know, what money is available and where is all that money? Because often you find suddenly someone can't answer those questions.
If you don't want to tell your children what you have, tell them where they can find out if they need to. Tell them where it is, because then, absolutely right, lasting powers of attorney. If you don't have one, your family might have to go to the court of protection to get access to your accounts and to make decisions for you. That costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. Whilst the lasting power of attorney, fine, there's an upfront cost to it, but it can save you a world of pain.
We're just about to wrap up. We've got about 90 seconds left. So we'll end on this question to both of you. Peter and Sam, what would you do if you were given £50,000 tomorrow to invest? And let's do that from the angle of also thinking about the family element here and what you might be passing down one day. Peter, how are you spending that big sum of money?
How am I spending that £50,000 on myself? No. I'm in a fortunate position where I have literally just repaid my mortgage, actually, from 25.
Gosh,
year 2000. I know. No, so I am now starting to think about these things. So I have been building up a fund so that should we decide on school fees or higher education, if it is appropriate, then you know that you can sort of subsidise your own payments out of income. So I'd add it to that.
Oh, very good. Sam, how would you?
I think I would sadly have to put some money into getting the mortgage down.
Yeah.
And then I'd put...
Very sensible, as we just learned.
Yeah, exactly. So then I put £9,000 into each of my 2 kids' junior ISAs. And then I think next summer I'd plan like a big holiday in a camper van around Europe for a month.
Sounds like a dream. Peter and Sam, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a fascinating 45 minutes. I think our audience at home will have learned a lot. Huge thank you for everybody who tuned in today, and the biggest thank you goes to Charles Stanley for making this event possible with The Spectator. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.